Amanda Reyes thought she was just flagging another suspicious shipping container at the port of Los Angeles. Special Agent Marcus Ellison believed he was chasing a standard drug trafficking ring. But neither of them knew they were stepping into the crosshairs of a faceless empire led by a digital ghost named Vantor that was laundering millions, breaching national security systems, and manipulating law enforcement from within. What began as a routine inspection would spiral into a silent war of deception, betrayal, and a criminal network that proved too advanced to vanish because it never needed to hide. In early 2022, a seemingly routine cargo container arrived at the port of Los Angeles. It carried paperwork declaring industrial cleaning supplies, complete with proper stamps and tracking codes. There was nothing visually unusual about it, and it moved through customs like thousands of others that day. But what made this container different was something no scanner or sniffing dog detected it: deception buried beneath layers of legal merchandise. Inside, stashed under drums of degreaser and bulk plastic, was over 400 kilograms of fentanyl and synthetic opioids, carefully vacuum sealed and packed to avoid detection. The drugs were worth tens of millions on the black market, but they weren't intended for immediate street sale. They were part of something larger, something that extended beyond U.S. borders and into the shadowy corridors of global crime. The discovery didn't happen by chance. A customs officer, 24-year-old Amanda Reyes, noticed that the shipper Northwell Trading LLC had a recently registered IN, no tax history, and no digital footprint. There was no phone number, no website, and the address listed traced to a strip mall in rural Idaho with no known shipping operations. While most containers cleared inspection in under 10 minutes, Amanda flagged this one for further review. A secondary inspection led to the discovery of inconsistencies in the manifest. The product quantity didn't match the weight. A small detail, but enough to raise suspicion. The container was held overnight and quietly handed over to a DEA agent working in port intelligence. The moment the DO opened the sealed crates and uncovered the drugs, they knew this wasn't the work of local traffickers. The synthetic compounds were traced to labs in China and Eastern Europe, routed through shell companies in Dubai and Mexico before arriving in the U.S. The DEA's forensic team determined that the packaging, labeling, and transport procedures were designed by professionals with military precision. But the most alarming detail wasn't the drugs themselves, it was the way they had been paid for. Blockchain ledgers revealed encrypted transactions linked to unregulated crypto exchanges operating in the Balkans. The shipment had been paid for in full 3 weeks before it even left its original port. Unbeknownst to the general public, this was the trigger point. This one container became the focal event that would set off a chain reaction of investigations, raids, and intelligence sharing that spanned continents. Federal officials saw clear signs that this wasn't just about trafficking narcotics. It was the beginning of something much larger, more coordinated, and infinitely more dangerous. Analysts began poring over satellite imaging, financial records, and communications tied to Northwell Trading. What they found started to reveal a disturbing pattern. Similar containers had entered ports in Houston, Newark, and Savannah with the same kind of fabricated documentation, all tied to different shell companies with mirrored activity. As the implications grew clearer, a decision was made at the highest level to initiate a full-blown interagency response. The operation would be classified. No public statements. No leaks. The federal government was preparing for something it hadn't dealt with in decades of full-scale crackdown against an invisible empire that had silently infiltrated America's borders under the guise of legitimate commerce. The decision to initiate a multi-agency task force came swiftly after the discovery at the port of Los Angeles. The operation, codenamed Crosshairs, was quietly assembled in a secure federal compound in Virginia. It brought together analysts, agents, and experts from the DEA, FBI, Homeland Security, IRS, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection. The objective was clear: to expose the full structure of the criminal network behind the synthetic drug shipment and dismantle it from the ground up. What made this different from past operations was the level of secrecy and coordination. Each agency worked in tandem, with no press releases, no court filings, and no digital paper trails. Every meeting was off-grid, every communication encrypted. It was a race against an enemy they couldn't yet see. The first major breakthrough came when agents traced one of the listed delivery addresses to a warehouse in Laredo, Texas. On the surface, the facility looked like a distribution center for auto parts. Trucks came and went daily, paperwork was in order, and a security guard patrolled the perimeter. But a drone surveillance team picked up unusual activity: late-night deliveries with no headlights, workers unloading trucks without uniforms, and pallets being wheeled into an unregistered side entrance. After a week of observation, a covert entry team moved in. Inside the warehouse, hidden behind racks of tires and motor oil, was a massive pill production operation. The setup included commercial-grade pill presses, chemical vats, and heat-sealing equipment. There were thousands of pills in various stages of processing, as well as lab-grade chemicals with labels scraped off. The workers had no identification, spoke no English, and vanished into silence when questioned. Further investigation uncovered a sophisticated communication system using burner phones and encrypted messaging apps. Messages were short, coded, and often referenced seemingly unrelated items like weather reports and currency exchange rates. Analysts worked around the clock to decode them. It soon became evident that the Laredo warehouse was only one node in a much larger network. Financial records obtained by the IRS showed that the building was leased by a shell company based in Delaware, which had been funneling funds through a crypto exchange registered in Estonia. The money had passed through at least 6 different wallets, split into thousands of microtransactions, a laundering technique that made tracing origins nearly impossible. Homeland Security traced one of the phones to a hotel in El Paso, where agents found a lead courier connected to 3 other warehouses in the Midwest. At each location, similar scenes played out: advanced drug manufacturing setups, anonymous workers, and false documentation. But there was something more unsettling. In every location, agents found evidence of digital infrastructure far beyond what was necessary for drug trafficking: servers, encrypted laptops, and USB drives with software tools commonly used in cyber intrusion. This wasn't just a narcotics ring. It was beginning to look like a front for something far more complex and dangerous. The drugs were the revenue stream, but the digital footprints suggested a dual-purpose one that reached into the realm of cybercrime and possibly even state-sponsored sabotage. The web was growing, and so was the urgency. What had begun as a drug interdiction was now spiraling into something uncharted. The digital trail uncovered in the warehouse raids pointed investigators toward a new layer of the operation. It wasn't just about physical product, it was about information. Encrypted devices recovered from the sites contained fragments of data that didn't belong in the hands of traffickers. One hard drive carried malware tools used in global ransomware attacks. Another had fragments of code linked to espionage operations previously traced to Eastern Europe and parts of Asia. Federal cybersecurity experts were brought in to assist, and their findings escalated the case to a new level of threat. The drug network, it appeared, was a funding arm for a hybrid criminal intelligence apparatus. Analysts found connections between IP addresses used by the network and recent breaches in financial institutions, hospital systems, and defense contractor servers. They weren't stealing money, they were stealing access. Keyloggers and credential harvesting scripts had been quietly running on systems for months, and no one knew. It became clear that the same people trafficking synthetic opioids were also penetrating cyber networks for high-value data. Emails, logins, blueprints, and classified schematics were found on encrypted partitions. It was no longer a federal drug case, it was now a national security issue. What troubled officials most was the level of discipline behind the operation. Every server had a built-in kill switch. Every drive had self-racing scripts. Several agents observed that even the couriers, who often knew little about the actual operation, followed strict protocols: no names, no repeated routes, no devices left unmonitored. The organization behind this had invested in digital training, operational security, and psychological control, and they were good at disappearing. The name Vantor first appeared in a decrypted message thread found on a seized laptop. It was referenced with reverence, almost fear, by others in the chain. Vantor wasn't a name tied to any existing criminal file. There were no photos, no fingerprints, no voice records, just a username and a trail of vanishing digital signatures. Theories quickly developed. Some believed Vantor was a person. Others believed it was a team, or even a code name for a foreign intelligence asset. But one thing was agreed upon: Vantor was orchestrating the bigger picture. With every lead, the mystery deepened. Surveillance drones tracked cargo vans to small tech companies in suburban areas, which turned out to be nothing but empty offices with a single server rack inside. Financial transactions disguised as software consulting payments, linked to corporations that didn't exist beyond digital storefronts. Even utility bills and employee rosters were fabricated to fool casual inspection. It was a shadow economy fueled by drugs but powered by stolen data and ghost infrastructure. The task force, now joined by NSA analysts, realized they were up against an operation that had no national identity, no central leadership, and no borders. It wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was a modular, decentralized network built to survive disruption and evolve with every takedown. What was once a straightforward federal crackdown had become a digital war against an invisible empire. In the summer of 2023, a coordinated series of raids were executed in Miami, Atlanta, and Chicago. News agencies were tipped off just enough to capture footage of agents in tactical gear storming suburban homes and office buildings. 6 individuals were arrested, and their mugshots were released to the press. They were labeled as senior members of a global trafficking and cybercrime syndicate. For a brief moment, the headlines painted the operation as a resounding success. Statements from federal agencies praised the outcome as a decisive blow to the criminal network. But inside the task force, the mood was grim. Investigators knew the people taken into custody weren't the real architects. They were decoys, planted figures meant to give the illusion of finality. The 6 suspects had spotless records and minimal digital footprints. Background checks revealed inconsistencies in their employment history, false educational credentials, and fabricated references. 2 of them didn't even exist in any government database prior to 2021. After several weeks of interrogation, agents realized the suspects were hired actors or manipulated fall guys. They spoke in rehearsed phrases and provided no useful information. Their arrests were orchestrated to buy time for the real operatives to vanish and restructure. It was the perfect smokescreen, and it worked. Funding for Operation Crosshairs began to shrink soon after the public success narrative was pushed. Some agencies were pulled back. Others redirected resources elsewhere. The sense of urgency faded, at least on the surface. Behind the scenes, however, a quieter investigation continued. Suspicion grew within the task force that someone on the inside was leaking sensitive information. Each time a raid was planned, the location seemed unusually well prepared or recently vacated. Surveillance logs vanished. Intel reports were delayed. Hidden burner phone, found shredded and partially burned in a hotel dumpster, held the breakthrough. Forensic reconstruction linked the phone to a D-analyst who had worked in the agency for over a decade. His name hadn't come up in any internal audits, and his security clearance was high enough to access multi-agency coordination files. He had quietly inserted code into scheduling software relaying key data to an unknown third party through encrypted cloud drives. When the analyst was arrested, his computers were confiscated and subjected to deep-level forensics. Among the deleted files was a folder labeled Project Egress. It contained what appeared to be an emergency escape framework for operatives across multiple states. Alternate identities, transport routes, offshore account details, and timing protocols were mapped out in alarming detail. Investigators now understood why every suspect had been one step ahead. The organization had someone feeding them live updates on federal movements. Worse still, buried in the metadata was a familiar signature traces of communication linked to the elusive Vantor. The ghost figure wasn't just leading the criminal side. They were shaping the counter-narrative, influencing internal disruption and controlling the timing of public disclosure. What looked like a successful federal crackdown was, in truth, a masterclass in misdirection. The real war was still ongoing, but now it was being fought in silence. By early 2024, Operation Crosshairs had evolved into a fragmented shadow of its former self. Dozens of arrests had been made, millions of dollars in assets were seized, and several drug labs and shell companies were neutralized. On paper, it looked like a major federal success. Internally, however, the core of the network remained untouched. The most advanced operations had simply disappeared, abandoning physical locations and going fully digital. The raids had only scraped the surface. targeting expendable fronts while the heart of the machine pulsed quietly somewhere beyond the reach of conventional enforcement. The trail went cold in several key cities. Surveillance failed to detect any new shipments. Crypto wallets linked to the network went dark. Websites that once disguised operational communication were wiped clean. It appeared, to many in law enforcement, that the empire had gone dormant, but others believed it had only adapted. The digital evidence suggested that the network had shifted its structure, moving deeper into encrypted networks, utilizing AI-generated identities, and relying on automation to minimize human exposure. The organization had learned from every move federal agents made, improved. Then came an anomaly. In June 2025, a newly registered company in Nevada called Vanguard Commercial Logistics purchased 5 warehouses in cash. The names on the registration documents didn't raise flags at first, but their filing patterns, purchase behaviors, silent digital footprint mirrored Northwell Trading, the same company that had triggered the original investigation 3 years earlier. Investigators noticed a familiar rhythm: microtransfers through obscure crypto exchanges, sudden shipments of industrial goods, and a lack of employee visibility. But unlike before, there were no mistakes this time. The operation was airtight. Attempts to initiate a new federal probe were quietly stalled, as some key agents had already been reassigned. Others were instructed to archive their findings under sealed orders. Unofficially, it was understood that no further action would be taken unless hard evidence re-emerged. The task force had been quietly dismantled, its records distributed and compartmentalized across multiple departments. No formal statements were made. No press releases followed. Among the few agents still quietly monitoring the case, there was growing consensus that Vantor, whoever now ran the operation, had won. Not in the traditional sense, but through a strategy of endurance, misdirection, and calculated retreat. The network had outlasted pressure, adapted to surveillance, and erased its weakest links. It had never needed a single face, a single headquarters, or a single motive. It simply evolved. One final detail sent a chill through those still watching. A message appeared on a defunct private forum once used by anonymous cartel associates. It simply read, "The game never ends. It only resets." Attached was an animated graphic of a chessboard, all pieces cleared except one a queen, untouched in the center. To this day, no one has confirmed the identity of Vantor. No final arrests have been made, and no containers have been flagged with the same precision since. For the public, the operation ended years ago. But for those who know the truth, the silence is just another strategy, one that signals the next phase is already underway.